Welcome to this new webinar organized by the Policy Center for the New South, where we will delve into a topic that resonates globally but holds particular significance for developing economies. Recently, there has been a significant increase in global food prices, affecting nations worldwide, especially those in the process of development. There are many complex factors driving these price hikes that have raised concerns about their impact on the socioeconomic structure of vulnerable nations. We will try to uncover the various aspects of this issue, including economic, environmental, and geopolitical factors. Understanding the consequences of rising food prices is crucial for crafting effective policies to protect the well-being of communities in developing economies. In this webinar, we will explore the root causes, outcomes, and potential strategies to tackle the challenges posed by the surge in food prices, providing a comprehensive understanding of its implications for sustainable development. To discuss this subject, I am joined today by Dr. Isabelle Sakok. She is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. She's a development practitioner, policy analyst, researcher, and teacher. She has worked in most regions of the developing world, including Africa, North and South of the Sahara, Asia, South, Southeast, and Asia, and also Latin America. She has taught courses on agricultural policies and institutions at the World Bank, the School of Agricultural and Rural Department, Renmin University of China, but also the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. She is also a professor at the Université Polytechnique Mohammed VI in Morocco. I am also joined today by Dr. Hafiz Ghanem, who is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. He's a development expert with a large number of academic publications and more than 40-year experience in policy analysis. He's project formulation and supervision and management of multinational institutions. He has worked in over 40 countries in Africa, Europe and Central Asia, Middle East, and North Africa. Southeast Asia also. Between 2015 and 22, he was vice president of the World Bank, initially responsible of the Middle East and North Africa, then for Sub-Saharan Africa, and then East and Southern Africa. To delve into the subject today, I'm happy to invite the two experts in this webinar, and I will go directly the floor to Dr. Isabelle Sakok, who will share with us a presentation about this topic. Dr. Isabelle, the floor is yours.
Okay, wonderful. And you're going to control the slide, yes? Okay. All of you know that rising food prices is always bad news because most of us are net food buyers, not net food sellers. Even in developing countries where agriculture is important, and where the majority, the smallholders, are in millions. They are net food buyers. In our turbulent world, rising food prices is even worse news because prospects for global growth already that have been subdued are expected to be lower again, while we have restrictive credit policies that raise interest rates and dampen economic activity. This is all to say that we are operating in a pretty bad environment. So in my presentation, I'd like to focus on developing countries whose governments are fiscally constrained. The impact, and that is the focus of the talk, will depend heavily on which subgroup you are talking about. For my purpose, 3 subgroups are important: the poor and vulnerable versus the better off, poor food importers versus food exporters, and oil exporters versus oil importers. So we'll think about these 3 groups as I go along. Okay, slide number 2. Thank you. In the interest of time, I will state my main messages up front. Number 1, the number of poor and vulnerable are in billions, not millions, and growing. Number 2, the impact of rising prices on the poor and vulnerable is devastating. And that is not only in the short run, but also in the long run, even when prices become stable. The causes are multiple: wars and pandemics, climate change, disasters, high inequality in the distribution of incomes and opportunities, oil price spikes, underdevelopment, and I can go on, and we will discuss these later. Number 4, government policies to shield the poor and vulnerable do provide a minimum level of food security. They are necessary, but they're often problematic for solving the underlying hunger problem. Hunger and food security problem needs to be solved in a sustainable fashion. Number 5, and that's where I'd like to spend some time, the successful transformation of agriculture within the pursuit of a development trilogy should be priorities if countries want to achieve sustainable food security. Okay, next slide. I think all this is probably well known to all of you. In our world that produces food for all, and you may have seen Conway's book on 1 billion hungry, can we feed the world? We still find that some 857 million people suffer hunger, and some 2.4 billion are food insecure. These are FAO numbers. The prevalence of undernourishment in Africa is nearly 20% of the population, 20%. That's a lot. And it's above its rate of around 17% in 2014, and well above the average in Asia, that's put at 8.5%, and Latin America at 6.5%. Of course, COVID was a disaster. Some 720 and 800 million people suffered hunger. One of the worst news in my view is severe food insecurity is forecasted to increase, not decrease, to increase in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and in MENA, Middle East and North Africa, from around 11% to 17% from 2006 to 23, which is this year. Next slide. Well, there is no shortage of bad news. The global report on food crisis estimates that population in crisis has risen from 135 in 2019, just before the pandemic, to 193 in 21. And it's around 27% of total population in 53 countries. Of these countries, which had over 1 million children under 5 years old who were wasted. Wasted means that your weight is too low for your height. 9 of these are in sub-Saharan Africa: Ethiopia, Sudan, Chad, Nigeria, Niger, South Sudan, Somalia, DRC, and Mali, and 2 elsewhere, Afghanistan and Yemen. The main causal factors for these is actually obvious: violent conflict, weather extremes, pandemic and non-pandemic related economic downturns. Next slide. Now, why is this rising food prices so devastating? It's devastating because the livelihoods of the poor, the expenditures are dominated by food. The extreme poor spend 2/3 of their meager incomes on food. The poor and vulnerable around 35 to 40%. Just imagine 40% of your income goes on food and the food prices are going up. So chronic hunger in utero and undernutrition in childhood has lasting negative impacts on health, heightening vulnerability to disease, schooling, and ability to learn, and on-the-job productivity in adulthood. So undernutrition early in life casts a long shadow on your prospects later. So last year, 2022, around 22% of children worldwide, or more than 1 in 5, were stunted. In sub-Saharan Africa, it was worse. It's 2 out of 5 were stunted. In the Middle East and North Africa, MENA suffers from the double burden of child obesity. It's because they don't have the right nutrients and undernutrition. To make matters worse, the populations of both MENA and sub-Saharan Africa are relatively young compared to other regions. Sub-Saharan Africa population is even younger than in MENA. So this is a key link to the far-reaching and sometimes irreversible damage in terms of limited prospects of prosperity for the next generation. So through undernutrition, the scourge of poverty goes on. We all know we live in turbulent times. That's no news at all. In our last food price rises, 2007, 8, and 2010 and 12, that pushed over 1 billion people into extreme hunger and triggered widespread social unrest. But this time, it's a lot worse. Since COVID-19, we have multiple crises that have undermined the adequate flow of food and other supplies. For example, supply chain dislocations, Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggering food price inflation that we're talking about, hurting lower income, food import dependent countries of MENA and sub-Saharan Africa the most. Climate disasters in quick succession, strained government budgets, and debt distress in many developing countries. The last I looked at the IMF list, 36 countries in Africa were under some form of debt distress. Interest rate rises to curb this inflation in many high countries leads to a very tight monetary policy. Increasing geopolitical tensions is fragmenting and weakening a cohesive world response to global crisis. But there are more. This is bad already, but there are more. Let's go to the next slide. So governments cannot just stay idle in the face of such tremendous social distress. So governments in many developing countries and rich countries as well have resorted to social safety net expansion with cash and in-kind transfers, delivery of food aid, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. We have increased food and fuel subsidies, for example, in Egypt, food subsidies in Morocco and Tunisia. We have price controls for what Morocco calls strategic commodities. The most famous one is the one on FNBT, Farine Nationale de Blé Tendre. You have overvalued domestic currency, for example, the Naira, that's Nigeria, with preferential allocation of foreign exchange to protect wheat and flour imports. Mainly the cities use that. Insulating domestic economy. There are all kinds of manners of doing that. For example, Ethiopia has banned white maize exports to East Africa, and that's since 2008 crisis, and maintained an overvalued beer. Eliminated taxes and tariffs on imported wheat. Kenya is insulating maize and wheat prices. Actually, there are many more, and if you're interested, you can look at IFPRI that has detailed studies on those. Okay, next slide. So these short-term measures are very costly, but they're also very distortive. For one, they divert resources from investing in long-term growth, which is really the only solution to this miserable problem. Targeted and inclusive social safety nets, they can be complemented with programs, so they are not a total loss. They can improve job skills, they can strengthen resilience to climate shocks, they can invest in the productivity and sustainability of local agriculture. This, like in Ethiopia's productive safety net program, which I think is one of the better programs. But broad-based product market intervention, and these are very popular because they work in the short run and are relatively easy to do. Price controls, food and fuel subsidies, export bans, manipulating trade tariffs and exchange rates. All of these are distortive. The problem with distortion is that they dampen incentives to invest and improve productivity and efficient resource allocation. So that's where we are. Fiscally strained governments, and so many governments face difficult trade-offs between urgent short-term needs, and these are urgent because people's lives are at stake, and long-term investments. For example, in MENA, urgent short-term financing needs I see from the World Bank papers are in billions of dollars are expected to rise. In sub-Saharan Africa, where governments are really stressed out, but they have to address the perfect storm of food, fuel, and fertilizer crisis. However, both regions must invest in growth promoting long-term structural changes to boost shared productivity. So the question is, how do you do that? Okay, next slide. Well, I like to turn to Timur, who shows in this diagram, simple diagram, why just short-term measures are not enough. Necessary, but not sufficient. In his book, Food Security and Scarcity, Why Ending Hunger is So Hard, Timur shows that you need a holistic approach, not just short term. Otherwise, you'll just be stuck in the short term. The first quadrant on the left, managing food crisis and budgeting for safety nets. This is what we see governments do when they're in a pinch. But they have to invest to improve people's resilience to shocks. That's the micro. And they have to figure ways of increasing inclusive economic growth and stable prices. Only when you have these three, only when governments are able to move on these three fronts, macro, micro, short, and long, you can actually have sustainable food security. So that is really a big challenge. So next slide. Timur also points out, and that is really important for developing countries in particular, that there's a virtuous circle of synergistic interactions between sustainable food security and inclusive modern economic growth. I mean, in his paper, it's mainly based on Asian experiences. He writes that food security and economic growth interact in mutually reinforcing process over the course of development. No country has sustained rapid economic growth without first achieving food security at the macro level. No country, that is quite a challenge. In 2015, he writes, no country has succeeded in its industrial revolution without a prior or at least simultaneous agricultural revolution. Neglecting agriculture in the early stages of development is neglecting development. So, how do you promote an agricultural revolution? That is the million-dollar question. How to achieve a successful agricultural transformation. Next slide. In my research, I tried to find a common pattern in all countries where agriculture has successfully transformed. What do I mean by successful transformation? Two things must happen. One, productivity increases in agriculture must be sustained over 2 to 3 decades. It's a long-term thing. It's not like 1 year, 1 year. Two, the incomes of the majority of rural people, majority, not minority, of farm and rural people must go up. So to get these results, you need at least 5 conditions. One is a stable macroeconomic and political stability. I don't think anybody will dispute that. Number 2, you need an effective technology transfer system. Nobody will dispute that either. 3, you need access to lucrative markets, because why do you produce more? You want to sell. You don't just produce for your own family more. 4, and this is a very big one, an ownership system, including a system of use rights that rewards individual initiative and toil. I mean, on this, there's so much work that has been done on this to show that when farmers do not have the incentives to invest or do not have the collateral to invest, they do not invest, period. 5, employment creating non-agricultural sectors. Now, this is also important because when agriculture is that productive, it will give up labor. Labor will flow from rural areas to non-rural areas, and they must be absorbed in income, in employment that is at least as lucrative as rural. Otherwise, it's just exporting poverty, which is happening in many developing countries. You just have all these people flocking to non-agriculture and just staying there. So while all of these conditions are obvious to almost everybody, and I had the good chance to discuss this with my World Bank colleagues, and other people too, we notice that only a minority of governments in developing countries have been able to create these conditions and to sustain these conditions for decades. So of course, then the question is again, why? I mean, if you look at any of the countries we've talked about in Africa or any other countries that are reeling from this high food price, they have probably none of those, or they don't have 3 or 4. But the key thing is you need to have the 5 of them, and you need to maintain it for decades. So it's not like a one season, one election cycle wonder. You have to change the system completely. So why are we not able to do that in developing countries? So one question always leads to the other. Okay, the next slide and the last one. Here, I'll just put it as a question. Obviously, it is something in our political economy that is stopping us. The political economy of accelerating mutually reinforcing processes of agricultural transformation, equitable growth with stability. That's what we need to find. And here again, I find this development trilogy from Timmer really helpful. He points out you need 3 things. That's why it's a trilogy. You need growth. Without growth, there's nothing to talk about but misery. You need equity. You cannot have a few millionaires and the majority of people hungry. And you need stability. You can't have wars and social upheavals, etc. So governments have the challenge of moving along within this framework. And the important thing is, especially for developing countries, the pivotal role of agriculture and rural economy. Because when I look at the budgets of many African governments, even after they were told that they need at least 10% to spend on agriculture, I mean, 2%, 4%, whatever. I mean, in simple terms, despite all the rhetoric, agriculture is neglected in much of Africa. It's simply neglected. Agriculture and the rural economy is central to achieving them. And when you look at countries in Asia that have been able to it, or you look at Western countries that are high industrial countries, they have developed their agricultures too. So this is, to me, the main challenge we have. If we are not going to be always suffering from high food prices, we need to develop our agriculture and rural economy in such a way that the entire economy transforms. And that is another big subject, is how do you do it? But I will just leave it at that as a question that we can pursue later. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, dear Isabel Sakog, for this very insightful presentation. I will share some points that you have raised in this presentation. The first one is going to be that the global crisis of poverty and vulnerability, as the number of individuals living in poverty has reached unprecedented levels, surpassing billions and showing a concerning trend of growth. The second point is the devastating impact of rising food prices. The poor and vulnerable bear the brunt of escalating prices, experiences not only immediate hardships, but also enduring long-term consequences that exacerbate their struggles. The third is the diverse causes of the vulnerability, as there are many multiple factors contributing to the plight of the poor, including conflicts, pandemics, climate change, disasters, income input and opportunity disparities, oil price fluctuations, and underdevelopment. Government policies dilemma, while government policies aim to provide a minimum level of food security for the poor and vulnerable, they often face some challenges in addressing the root causes of hunger and food insecurity, necessitating a more sustainable approach. And last, the important point of prioritizing agricultural transformation, a pivotal solution lies in prioritizing the successful transformation of agriculture, and embracing this shift within the framework of the development agenda is crucial for developing economies. Without further ado, I will give the floor now to Dr. Hafiz Ghanem. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Now that Isabel made this very good presentation on what is on the overall world, actually, and all the impact of developing countries in general. What I'll try to do in a few minutes is just focus on our region, on Africa, and go a little bit deeper there. First, I will describe briefly the situation in Africa, going from what Isabel was saying to go into a little bit more specificity of the Africa case. And then I will conclude by making some suggestions, because I believe that Africa actually should not have anybody who is food insecure. Africa has enough natural resources, has enough people to be able to feed itself. And I believe what I'm going to recommend is an Africa-wide initiative for food security and how that can be achieved. But let me start first by responding to the main question of this seminar, which is the impact of high food prices. As Isabel explained, food prices, when they are high, that is good for food producers, but it's bad for food consumers. And most of us are food consumers. And that is where it hurts. Actually, in our continent, in Africa, even farmers, many of our farmers are net food consumers, that they are not producing enough to feed themselves. So overall, when you look at our continent, we are importing food for about $50 billion a year. That was the number in 2022. So as food prices go up, this import bill goes up, and the price of food on our local markets increase. There's a very important number that we need to look at, which is what we call the dependency ratio, and especially cereal dependency ratio. In our continent, in Africa, our dependency ratio for cereals is 30%. That is 1/3 of all of the cereals consumed on the continent is imported. Now, compare this, the second largest region in terms of dependency, cereal dependency, is Asia, and that number is 8%. So this is huge in terms of our cereal dependency ratio, and in terms of our dependence on imports. So the moment food prices go up, immediately the consumers are impacted, and as Isabel explained very well, it is especially the poor people who are hurt most, because the bigger part of their budgets are allocated to food. Now, food prices have increased recently. The biggest shock was because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, which impacted the ability of Ukraine and Russia to export grains and oils and many of our countries, I'm thinking especially of Egypt, Nigeria, Algeria, are big importers of Russian and Ukrainian grains. And this has led to an increase in prices. And immediately what we see is an increase in the number of undernourished people. Isabel presented the overall number of undernourished people in Africa, which is around 20%. The prevalence of undernourishment, which is the number today, but actually, if you we were doing much better. This 20% that is the number, which is 19-20%, which is the number of undernourished people in Africa today. This is a big increase compared to where we were in 2015. In 2015, it was 15-16% off. And it is taking us back to where we were at the beginning of the century. And that the effect of, and that comes from three reasons why we are going backwards rather than forwards in terms of food security on our continent. First reason I mentioned was the shock that came from the war in Ukraine. Then we also had the shock of external shocks, war in Ukraine, and the crisis, the pandemic impact on the economy and on prices. So external shocks pushed prices high and increased hunger on the continent. The second reason is climate change. Climate change, which is impacting agriculture more in Africa enormously. So if you look at Africa is in a very unfavorable situation. The whole continent is only producing about less than 4% of, is only emitting less than 4% of carbon in the world, yet it is the continent most impacted by climate change. If you look at increases in temperature, over the last 20 years, the average temperature in Africa has been warming at a rate of 0.3 degrees Celsius every decade. This might sound small, but it's actually huge. At the beginning of the 20th century, the rate of increase of the rate of warming in Africa was 0.08. So this is like more than this is about a fourfold increase in the rate of increase in global warming. The result of the higher temperatures we feel right now with unprecedented changes in climate, flooding, droughts, cyclones. If you look at just flooding and drought events, they have increased by floods have increased by 180% in the last 10 years compared to the last 10 years of the 20th century. 180% increase in flooding in Africa, 30% increase in the in droughts for the same period. So all of this is obviously impacting agriculture. So they have contributed to a 34%. The estimate is that climate change has contributed to a 34% decline in agricultural production on the continent. And the projections are that if we continue along those lines, crop yields in Africa are going to drop by anywhere between 5 and 17% by 2050. So this is the third reason why we are facing this increase in hunger on the continent, the climate change. The other reason why we're facing an increase in hunger is also man-made, like climate change, but climate change is made by men in the north. The second reason is conflict in Africa. So this is man-made by us, Africans. The increase in conflicts in Sudan, in DRC, in Somalia, in the Sahel. If you look at all those countries that I just mentioned, all those areas where there is conflict, these are the areas also where you have the highest rates of hunger. So, this is a little bit some Africa-specific reasons of why prices have been higher and why we are going backwards in terms of fighting hunger on the continent. And I would like also, I mean, just to make another point on in terms of hunger. Hunger is not evenly distributed across the continent. I mean, when I say like roughly 20%, 1 of every 5 Africans goes to sleep hungry. This number is much higher in Central Africa, where 1 of every 3 people in the Central Africa region goes to bed hungry. In East Africa, 30%, also roughly 1 in 3. Numbers are much lower for the Southern Africa, where then we get 1 in 10 are hungry, and for North Africa, where you only get 7% of people who are hungry. So the 20% figure also hides a lot of variation and hides a lot of misery that we need to be focusing on. The other point, and then I will go look a little bit at the policies. I would like just to underline a point also that Isabel made, which is on under. I was talking about hunger, under what we call undernourishment, but there is also malnutrition, the quality of food. And I was reading a report of the World Bank yesterday, which said that 90% of Africans are unable to afford a healthy diet. So they're getting bad and unhealthy diets, and that gives us and that is true whether you're talking about North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. It's true everywhere. And when Isabel says, you know, children in North Africa, you have this dual problem of undernourishment and obesity. The reason people are obese is that they're eating too much carbohydrates, too much sugar, which are more of the cheaper and low quality foods. So let me stop here. This is describing the problem, and go into now what I believe. As I said at the beginning, I said Africa should not be in a position of importing 1/3 of its cereal consumption. Africa should be able to produce. And I just give you one number that is a bit shocking, which is let's look at what is the cereal yield of cereals in Africa. The average yield for cereal production in Africa is 1.65 tons per hectare. The average yield of cereal production in the world is 4.1 tons per hectare. This means that our yields are less than half the average yield in the rest of the world, which means that just by improving yields, you can just double cereal production. And you will not need to. So I tried to understand why are yields so low. And in general, and then I'll go to 2 specific points. In general, it's because we are investing very little in agriculture in Africa. We're investing, if you look at fixed investment in African agriculture compared to the value added in African agriculture, it is 10%. The average for the world is 16%. But I mean, if you look at countries with high productivity, like in Europe or America, you have like 30% is the rate of investment. What are those people investing in? Yeah, they invest in technology, which is extremely important. Especially, I talked about climate change. You need to invest in research and development to come up with new types of crops that can withstand climate shocks. But you also invest in irrigation. In Africa, only 1.5% of African agricultural land is irrigated. The average for the world is 7.3%. So the world average is 7.3%. We're at 1.5% irrigation. So being dependent on rain-fed agriculture in a world of climate change with droughts and flooding explains partly this low yields. Another explanation for the low yields is very low fertilizer use. In Africa, a fertilizer use is 16 kilograms per hectare. The average for the world is 73 kilograms per hectare. In Asia, they are using 111 kilograms per hectare of agricultural land, of fertilizers. That's why they had a green revolution in Asia and we did not. So that is, so they're using maybe 7 or 8 times as much fertilizers as we are in Africa. Why we are not investing in agriculture? Lack of resources, limits on financing. Why aren't we investing in fertilizers? Because we're importing the fertilizers. We are doing much more import of fertilizers, and it's expensive, and farmers are poor, and so they're not using enough fertilizers. So this is the situation. We have hunger, we have very low yields, and now what is the solution? Isabel talked about having to develop your agriculture. Let me now try to very quickly, because I know we're supposed to finish at 4, is that I think that food security is such an important issue that we need to have a Pan-African approach. It cannot just be each country on its own. We're not each, I don't think it is conceivable that each African country on its own, especially the smaller countries, would be able to achieve food security and food sovereignty. So I think that the first point that I would like to raise is that we need to use the Continental Free Trade Agreement as an opportunity to increase trade among African countries, especially trade in food. And we have seen cases where countries are stopping exports from amongst African countries. That should not happen. So I believe that the African Union should give a specific mandates to the Secretariat of the ACFTA to make sure the free flow of food products between African countries. The second point is that we need to invest in agricultural infrastructure, especially irrigation. Most of our irrigation projects, the possible irrigation projects, are cross boundaries. You know, rivers go from one country to the other. My suggestion is that we need to work. The African Union Commission needs to work with the FAO, with the World Bank, and especially with the African Development Bank to come up with big regional irrigation projects on how can we enhance irrigation. So that is the second thing, is really a big push using the existing financing mechanism to prioritize agricultural infrastructure, irrigation, but also transport and so on.
Sorry, Dr. Hafid, we still have only some few minutes left.
Yes, I'm nearly done. So my third point, actually, I have to finish and run. So my third point is on is very important. You'll find it interesting, Ahmed, because it is on fertilizers. We have private sector in Africa. We have big fertilizer producers in Africa. OCP is one example in Morocco, but also we have seen big producers in Nigeria. Dangote just put in place a huge fertilizer factory in Nigeria. So we need to invest more in fertilizers across the continent. We do not have to be dependent on importing fertilizers, because we saw when there was the war in Ukraine, the price of fertilizers goes up and so on. So and that has to be done by the private sector. And so what kind of policies, what kind of incentives do we need to put for the private sector? The fourth point is on research. Africa should learn from the Indians and put together an African Council of Agricultural Research, similar to the Indian Council of Agricultural Research. And that is something that we need to do. And my fifth point is on safety nets. We need to have a financial safety net, both to help countries, maybe using the Afri-Exim Bank, to help countries when there is a shock to their balance of payments because of higher food prices, and also to help the poor in terms of safety nets. It's a much better policy to provide cash transfers to the poor when food prices go up. It's a much better policy than subsidizing the price or putting a limit on price increases, because it is much less. It does not distort the market incentives. So let me stop here. Thank you very much, Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hafiz Ghanem. You have raised the question of cereal dependency in Africa, which is almost 30%, and this is a very concerning situation. As food prices go up, the consumers are impacted directly, and especially the poor people, as their revenues goes essentially for their food basket. The situation is even more concerning for oil exporting countries who are food importers, like, for example, Nigeria and Algeria that you have mentioned at the beginning of your presentation. We have currently around 20% of undernourished people in Africa, which is a very big increase if you compare it to the levels of 2015. So we are in a very alarming situation. You have raised the reasons why we are going backward in this in the food security status in Africa, and I thank you very much for extending the debate to the African continent, where there is a majority of the developing and poor countries. First of all, you mentioned the shock of the war in Ukraine, and that raised the question of the food dependency of countries in Africa, especially for cereals coming from Ukraine and Russia. Also, the pandemic and its impact generally on the economy, and also climate change, which is impacting the agricultural productivity in a big way. I have before concluding this webinar, I will address my questions. Dr. Hafid is leaving us today in this webinar, is now going to be with us until the end. I have one question that I will address to Dr. Isabel Sakok. I want to know what, in the audience's view, are the most important causes of widespread hunger and poverty that can be solved by ordinary individual citizens, as opposed to government policies and organized groups. Can you give us just an example of a country or countries to answer this? And please be very quick, because
my main point is ordinary individuals that are not organized cannot do that much. You can help your neighbor, but usually rich people live with rich people. Poor people live with poor people. And so my main point there is really to solve this hunger, food insecurity problem. It requires governments, it requires organization, and as Hafez said, it requires new institutions. It's not, and that is the main point I want to make, the free market is not going to do it. We need organization, we need governments, we need institutions, we need the African Union, or we need the Moroccan government, or we need companies. It's all organized. It's too big a problem. What we can do individually, which is very good, we can, help our neighbors and so on. But as I say, typically, middle-class people live with middle-class people, and we're not going hungry. Poor people live with poor people, and they are going hungry. There we touch on one of the big problems of food insecurity, is the inequality in our system. Our system is so unequal. I mean, the rich, the super rich, I'm talking of the United States now, they kind of fly to heaven, literally, in their jets. And the poor people sink and they have to have food aid. I think this is a big problem of food insecurity, is inequality of opportunities. Why are these people so damn poor? As Hafez pointed out, Africa has a lot of resources. The world has a lot of resources. Everybody that has looked at it says we are not in a Malthusian world. Productivity has increased enormously. Amartya Sen has told us that we live in a world of opulence, but we also live in a world of horrifying destitution of poor people. So my point is, it's a collective. We should see it as a collective responsibility to reduce poverty, food insecurity, and so that we're not left in 10 years' time, hopefully, developing countries are not so vulnerable. This is what, if there's any silver lining to this crisis we're going through, it is to show how vulnerable we are. All the faults in our system, inequality, underdevelopment, neglect of agriculture, the points that Hafez has made. We have not taken this problem seriously. You still see people arguing, why bother with agriculture? Those guys are dumb or slow at it. Yeah, they may be all that, but we make them so. That's our problem. Farmers are not inherently dumb or slow. They are absolutely essential. I mean, my point is always, please stop the neglect of agriculture. I mean, Hafez had pointed out in so many ways how it's neglected in Africa. I mean, why is Africa, food insecurity is going up? Other countries is going down. And yet Africa is, when you look at natural resources, the richest continent. You've got everything, every mineral you can think of. You have most of the uncultivated land. You have all the young people you can mobilize. So what is missing? So my point in raising it is to show that it's not an individual problem. We can help ordinary people, and we should, but the scale of the problem requires collective effort. I mean, institutions of every sort, and Hafez have pointed some that exist and some that should be created, but we need to take it seriously, not just like when the house is burning, we get the firefighters in, and then, forget. And then we forget again. You know, we've had food crisis, 73, 74, late 70s, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2000. It's not new. It's not a new problem. It's an old problem. We need to have a collective solution, and we need to work on it. I mean, that's one of the things I like about
Thank you
this
very much. Thank you very
seminar.
much, dear Isabel Sakov. I understand that it's a collective concern to the way the poor and vulnerable countries are rich of resources, and all what it takes is raising this question. It's a collective responsibility. I think that we should not neglect, as you said, the agricultural policy. It should be a priority in addressing hunger and food crisis in poor and vulnerable countries. Thank you very much, dear Isabel Sakok, and thank you also for Hafiz Ghanim, who left us today, for answering my questions and for the great presentation that you have presented today. It was a pleasure to have you with us. Also, a big thank you to all of you in the audience for your participation, and see you maybe in the next webinar. Thank you very much. And this comes to the end of our webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.